We're going to be looking in this program at the shadows of the heart and healing the wounds that bind us in our lives. We're going to be looking at the dark side of love and connection, the crooked, resistant, confused, sometimes destructive dimensions of what it means to connect with our fellow human beings. The pain that the shadows of the heart can create and how to heal these breakages within ourselves. So let's begin by acknowledging that the heart is not whole. The heart is not whole. The emotional heart that we have by the time we're adults is a fractured, battle-torn organ. It's limited by its own neuroses and fears, defended by stories, and frequently insecure and quite selfish. Such a wounded heart can easily look on connection as transaction and at other people as potential rescuers or assets in our lives. The wounded heart is often in survival mode, struggling to find its way in the world and unwilling to open up too much or let go of too much of its imaginary hold on control. This toughness that we see so often in relationships reflects the heart's underlying tenderness. It's because we are so very sensitive that we wound so easily and learn to protect ourselves reflexively from the cruelty of the world. Very often, if you scratch a cynic, you're going to find a disillusioned optimist who has suppressed her own heart's desires in order to avoid disappointment. And so we grow up with these wounded hearts and we spend the rest of our lives trying to heal them, trying to redeem the love, the trust, and the connection that we have lost. And we achieve this in a variety of ways, through therapy, through daily life, and mostly in the day-to-day, moment-to-moment relationships with the people that we care about. Our hearts are healed on the job, in other words, in the practice of loving itself, in staying when we want to run, in unlearning harmful patterns and beliefs, and doing the very hard work of freeing the people in our lives from the projections of our personal nightmares. Until one begins to dissolve these projections through insight, through practice, our loved ones can easily become stand-ins for our childhood villains, the inflictors of the original wounds that reverberate throughout our lives. Healing happens when we bring attention to our shadows without flinching, when we explore our damage deeply enough to reach some level of acceptance. Healing nearly always calls for acknowledging grief, unretrievable losses, and instances of irreparable damage that we cannot undo. Now, acceptance isn't the same as resignation or condoning harm that's been done to us. Acceptance simply means that we're willing not to be bound to the past and to our attachments to how things ought to be, becoming willing to live according to key philosophical principles. The first of these principles, when it comes to healing the wounds of the heart, is what the Stoics called the dichotomy of control. This means recognizing what we can change and what we can't change, including other people's behavior, things that have happened in the past, and future outcomes in our own lives. In the words of the Greek Stoic Epictetus, quote, "The chief task in life is simply this, to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I actually control," unquote. Now, this may sound obvious, but no single piece of wisdom could have greater impact when it comes to healing the wounds of the heart than this dichotomy of control. When you examine your own emotional shadows and how they're sustained in you, you begin to notice right away how much of your pain is linked to events from the past, and also to your inability to predict the future, and how powerless you feel over other people. We keep these wounds alive through repetition, through rumination, through obsession, worry, and also fear. So it's helpful just to take a moment to ask yourself, What memories do you dredge up reliably that are sure to cause you anguish? What predictions do you make about what's coming that keep you in an ongoing state of dread? What stories do you tell yourself on a regular basis that cause you emotional pain? And how do these patterns impact your relationships? That's the point. Because, of course, relationships exist within the context of our larger lives. If we're anxious about the state of the world, for example, as a lot of us are these days, this anxiety and anger are bound to seep into our relationships. For example, I have a friend whom I love dearly who is so enraged by the MAGA movement in the United States that it has nearly taken over his emotional life. Besides his ideology dominating his thoughts and his conversations, this friend of mine has cut off relationships with people in his life whose views fall outside of his story about what people should believe. Recently, he walked out on a friend in a restaurant after being offended by something that she said and stopped speaking to her. Now, obviously, his heart is hurting, and many of us share his concerns. But most of us are able to sequester our pain in such a way that politics don't cancel out the love that we feel for the people in our lives. When it comes to relationships, the dichotomy of control is a reliable gauge by which to navigate matters of the heart and to shift our perspective on wounds that bind us. So ask yourself, what are you not accepting about yourself or other people that damages your ability to love? What are you avoiding or attempting to manipulate in order to protect yourself from pain? And how does this avoidance only make things worse and turn your pain into suffering? For example, I know another fellow who no longer speaks to his mother. Now, cutting ties with family members who are abusive can be wise, of course. But in this particular case, this guy seems to have overreacted to a chance remark by his mother, and rather than confront her about his feelings, he chose instead to cut off all communication. That was 15 years ago. Without attempting therapy or any other means of helping himself heal this wound, the wound has only festered, and it causes him severe limitations in his personal relationships. His anger is palpable and it's easily triggered. He accuses his partner of being like his mother and withdraws from her on a regular basis. He eats and he drinks to excess. And he also spends a lot of time on his meditation cushion attempting to spiritualize his anger away. What he doesn't do, or hasn't yet done, is turn his attention on his own heart and done the investigative work of figuring out how to resolve and ultimately accept his own ambiguous feelings toward his mother. And that is how the pain of an offhanded remark can turn into decades of suffering. It's hard to watch this guy in his struggle with his unexplored feelings. It feels like watching a lion with a thorn in its paw, raging at the world, but simply because it's in so much pain. Now, healing begins when we move toward acceptance of things as they are, exactly as they are. And that almost always requires grieving and self-inquiry and releasing the stories that hold us captive. In this fellow's case, the story is simple. His mother judged him for something that he didn't do, and for that reason he can have nothing to do with her. That's his narrative. It's sealed and delivered. So you see, though, how this narrative empowers his fiction, and that's what we do. Instead of doing the uncomfortable work of setting his mother straight and releasing his emotions, he simply turns them into his nemesis by burying them deep and then closing the hatch. And that's often how we move through our lives, being manipulated by pain that we haven't resolved or accepted, and blaming our reactions on things that have nothing to do with what is actually true. The wounded heart is often indiscriminate in its reactivity, and it's driven by the need to act out, to find a release valve for painful emotions. So let's just look at a few areas where the heart is commonly wounded and how we might bring healing to these shadow dimensions of our emotional lives. Let's start with past trauma. Past trauma. Nearly all of us come to our adult relationships marked by loss and pain from the past. For most of us, this pain involves some form of trauma. Although it's important to remember, as Gabor Mate says, that there's capital T trauma and lowercase trauma. Capital T trauma is things like poverty, sexual abuse, abandonment, violence, and so on. Whereas lowercase traumas are things like being passed over for a sports team at school or being heartbroken in love. Now, it's tremendously helpful to be open about trauma in our close relationships. That doesn't mean that we can say everything to anyone, but as a rule, open is much better, since it allows you to be authentic and it also invites the other person to be candid as well. Remember that intimacy thrives on candor and the heart thrives on intimacy. I like what the writer Alain de Botton says about this. He says, for example, when you're going on a date, instead of the usual whitewashing about talking about how great you are and how wonderful everything in your life is, it's far better to start out by saying, this is how I'm crazy. How are you crazy? And the same goes for friendships and other close associations. When you open the window on past trauma and allow in more acceptance, more visibility, more attention, you're far more likely to establish and maintain healthy, durable intimacy. The second common shadow of the heart is fear of vulnerability. Fear of vulnerability. Many folks are terrified of letting their guard down and allowing others to see how fragile and confused they actually are. And yet vulnerability is the very essence of strength, as researchers like Brené Brown preeminently have found in their work. As Brené Brown puts it, quote, vulnerability is the first thing I look for in you, but it's the last thing I want you to see in me. In you, it's courage. In me, it's inadequacy. In you, it's strength and lovability. In me, it's shame. It's possible to heal our fear of vulnerability by remembering that vulnerability is in fact a social asset when we reveal it to people that we trust. And if we don't feel moved to be vulnerable with someone, that's information. That's something you pay attention to. What does that say about the truth of the relationship? This is a very important and often sobering question. Recently, I found myself in a situation where I felt vulnerable, but I had no inclination to share that vulnerability with the person I was with, someone whom I thought of as a friend. And that led to my doing some serious questioning and truth-telling that revealed how little I actually trust this person and how I've never actually allowed him to get too close. This was sad to acknowledge, but it was also very liberating, because it showed me where we actually stand. So I'm not play acting in some fiction that isn't actually true. The next shadow of the heart to look at is low self-esteem. And this is something we've talked about a lot in the Seekers Forum. In a secular, meritocratic, capitalist culture like ours, nearly void of spiritual education, where bad parenting is not infrequent, and we're taught to measure ourselves through external achievement and competition, many people suffer from the symptoms of ego diseases, insecurity, narcissism, severe self-judgment. Without healthy self-esteem, emotional connection can be very challenging. But self-esteem is conditional and can abandon us in moments of failure or pain, just when we need it the most, which is why shifting towards self-compassion tends to be more helpful. Low self-esteem can be healed by considering the dichotomy of control and practicing not blaming ourselves for things that aren't our fault. It's also ameliorated by self-compassion, focusing on kindness toward ourselves regardless of whether we're on an upswing or a downswing. The less antagonistic we are toward ourselves, the less likely we are to judge and aggress on other people, to blame them for our low self-esteem, or defend ourselves against vulnerability. We're far more likely to feel capable of emotional connection and equal to the task of loving other people. So ask yourself, how does personal self-esteem impact your relationships with others? If you had more self-esteem, how might that change your emotional connections? These are great questions to think about. The next common shadow of the heart is the fear of rejection. Huge. The terror of being pushed away, abandoned, thrown out of the magic circle, the place of safety and belonging, is hardwired in us as social animals. Humans have evolved to equate approval with survival. And particularly for those who've experienced trauma, staying connected becomes a kind of lifeline, whereas rejection can represent becoming an outcast. To avoid rejection, we are often willing to sacrifice our authenticity, our needs, our own deep desires, and that's why awareness of this rejection-avoiding tendency is so critical. We can heal the fear of rejection by exposing the life or death stories that we associate with rejection and what we imagine that it says about us. So, what do you actually believe will happen if you are rejected? Because it's this imagined outcome that is holding you hostage to your fears, the story that you have around rejection. It's not that rejection doesn't hurt, not that rejection doesn't have bad potential consequences. But these outcomes are almost never as dire as the wounded heart takes them to be. Looking into your fear of rejection and how it plays out across the board in relationships can be tremendously freeing and clarifying. The next shadow of the heart is a huge one, unresolved emotional issues, which of course can include low self-esteem and fear of rejection, but might also include things like jealousy, mistrust, possessiveness, envy, competitiveness, impatience, rigidity, and insecurity of myriad kinds. Obvious as it sounds, we can't overestimate the importance of doing our own inner work when it comes to creating safe relationship passage with another person. It is absolutely imperative to be willing to look at ourselves deeply if we hope to play well with others. For example, a friend's 60-year-old fiance was an emotional wreck. He's a wonderful man, generous, loving, but he had never done any therapy or tended to his childhood wounds. Even though my friend was in love with this guy, she was tired of being his emotional punching bag whenever he got depressed or triggered. And she threatened to call off the wedding unless he turned inward and did some of this inner work. And happily, he accepted the ultimatum. He began to see a therapist. He started to grieve, first acknowledge, and then begin to grieve losses that he'd avoided throughout his lifetime. And a year later, the two of them were married. But if he hadn't begun addressing his unresolved issues, this potentially happy relationship simply would have fallen apart. And that brings us to the next shadow of the heart that's adjacent to unresolved issues, and that's ineffective communication. Even though miscommunication is responsible for many relationship troubles, we tend to have too little understanding of how to communicate difficult feelings, how to express dissatisfaction without attacking other people, how to admit to ways that we've been dishonest, and to look at our own unskillful uses of language. To complicate things even further, today we have so many different mediums for communication that we can often find ourselves getting into trouble when we choose the wrong one to say what we need to say. For example, texting someone about a serious emotional issue is never a good idea. I learned that the hard way. Okay, text is not the right medium. Or we may choose the wrong moment. In communication, as in all things, timing is essential. And blurting out things at inappropriate times is bound to backfire. No matter how accurate or necessary the information might be, it needs to be delivered skillfully, and timing has a lot to do with that. Ineffective communication is healed, like the rest of these wounds, with care and with practice. I also recommend factoring in the Buddha's criteria for whether or not something needs to be said. You may remember the Buddha said, we should ask ourselves 3 questions before we speak. Is it true? Is it necessary? And is it kind? Is it true? Is it necessary? And is it kind? Imagine how many things you wouldn't say if you used those standards to measure what you were going to allow to come out of your mouth. And even when hard truths do need to be shared, we can learn to do that with kindness. Kindness above all. And the final shadow of the heart that I wanted to talk about today pertains to our resistance to change itself. We fight change itself. And that brings us again back to the dichotomy of control and knowing when to get out of the way of the flow of life, of the flow of impermanence. Allowing others to change in relationship is also tremendously challenging. Fear of loss can lead us to want others to stay the way they are in order to ensure our emotional safety and the security of our connection. But of course, love wants other people to be themselves and to honor our relationship, but not at the expense of their growth and their authenticity. Relationships that endure often contain flexibility and mutual respect, sufficient space as well as surrender. They tend not to be based on power, domination, or self-interest before the care of the people that we're connected to. And this is a balancing act. It's one that is forever evolving. Like everything else in nature, relationships expand and contract, they flow and they ebb. And being able to tolerate contraction times is a big part of being an emotional grown-up. Not looking to the other person to complete you, to take responsibility for your happiness, to heal your childhood wounds, or to pretend to be less complicated than they are, is the way to bond as loving adults. To recognize the wounds of the heart without being stopped by them. That really is where we find ourselves. We heal the fear of change by leaning into change, by opening to what we don't yet know, releasing the need to control outcomes, and also recognize the sacred mystery of the other and remember that they are not our possessions. We've been talking about that since the beginning of the year, in this year that we're looking at connection, and recognizing that the other is always a mystery. We cannot know another person completely, and what a beautiful thing that is. When you acknowledge that, they cease to be an object, right? Because fear wants to turn the other person into an object, something that we can count on and control without its own independent needs. A reflection of us, instead of being its own freestanding, autonomous subject. As we move through this program for the next couple of months, we're going to be revisiting these shadows that I've just been talking about, these common problem areas, and how wisdom and compassion can help us to heal them. Because we can make enormous progress when we bring attention to the places where we're wounded. And now let us do some writing. Jay, would you mind pulling up the card, please? Here we go. I'd like you now, please, to take 20 minutes to name the relationship-related wounds that you most want to heal in your life and why. What are the relationship-related wounds that stick in your craw, that cause you the most problem, confusion, or make you want to avoid relationships completely? And make sure to pay attention to the why, because of course the why is the story behind these wounds and your reason for wanting to heal them. Be as specific as you can be, please. 10 minutes into the writing, Jay will open up the breakout rooms if you would like to talk to other members. Otherwise, just keep on writing. 20 minutes.